Yeah, it is a little bit nerve-wracking when you're this side, isn't it? I've actually been really surprised this morning that I've actually been able to sit down, and I have really enjoyed the talks that I've already listened to. You were right, Liz. The speakers are amazing, brilliant. So, thank you. I want to share with you a little bit about my story. You've heard a little bit about this inside-out understanding, the principles, and I'm already going to get a little bit emotional about my story. But I want to share what a massive difference it can make in somebody's life. How much we can turn around the person that we were to the person that we can be. And even though I do feel a bit nervous here and a little bit tearful sharing with you, I know I'm going to do this. So I'll start with a few things. Did you know that you could buy chicken in white sauce in a tin? It's called chunky chicken. Every year in the United Kingdom, 104 women die through domestic violence and abuse. 62% of children that are in the house when an incident takes place are either hurt or affected in some way. $4.9 million women will experience some kind of domestic violence or abuse in their lifetime. And 2.4 million men will, and that is just in the UK. How many people does it take to completely turn that around? One. And that one might be you today, hearing something in this room. I keep catching my daughter's eye, and that's what I can't do. My daughter's here in the room listening to this, and that's me. I was labelled as a victim of domestic abuse and violence. I don't see myself as a victim. My then husband was labelled as a perpetrator. I don't see it like that. I don't see that we were victim and perpetrator. What I see now when I look is both of us were caught up in a misunderstanding of our own minds. And if we had understood how our minds work, if we had seen what I now see, what I now share with people, what I want to share with you, what I've shared with my family, none of us would have had to have gone through what we went through. And I would like to take you back to a day in 2007. It was a Sunday, and it was in June of 2007. And me and my then husband and my then 9-year-old son had been out for the day. When we went out for the day, my daughter, who was then 17, wasn't allowed to stay in the house on her own. So at 8 o'clock in the morning, when we left to spend our day out, she had to leave the house too. She was allowed back in the house only with permission to go to the bathroom or to have something to eat. And around about lunchtime, I get a phone call to ask if she can have something to eat. Can she go into the house and can she eat? So I said, yes, she could. So she said she wants chunky chicken, and there's a tin of it in the cupboard. So I asked her dad, can she have the chunky chicken? He says no. Chunky chicken isn't allowed that day. There were a lot of rules in our house, and it wasn't so much the rules, it was the fact that you never quite knew whether you'd broken them until you had. This day, it was really clear that was the rule, no chunky chicken. My daughter's quite feisty. She's got a mind of her own, and she doesn't like pointless rules. So she wants the chunky chicken, so she just tells me she's going to have it anyway. Luckily enough, he didn't hear that. So she continued, and she ate the chunky chicken. She wasn't stupid, and she knew what might happen. So she had the sense to wash the tin out, take the label off, put the label from the tin as far down into the rubbish as it could go, and to put the tin in with the recycling so it wouldn't be seen. So she might have got away with it. But when we got home On that particular day, it was decided that there would be a check of the house. So me and my son and my daughter stand in a line, and he begins to check around the kitchen, and he checks the cupboards, and he checks the tin. And he sees that in his rows of tins, there's no longer a tin of chunky chicken. And that's where it starts to get quite serious. He's really angry now. He's really furious. And he's yelling at us. And we're stood there. And he's yelling about parenting and yelling how this world is going to just go to hell if kids don't learn to do as they're told. And who's done this? Who's had the chunky chicken? And if I hadn't have known what he was capable of, I probably would have laughed, because it's not rocket science to know who must have eaten that. I'd been with him all day, and so had my son. And my daughter had been there on her own. She's looking at me, and I'm looking at her, and she doesn't really know what to do. And in the end, I nod at her, because there's nothing else to do. She's going to have to admit it, because there isn't another way out of this situation. So she says, "It was me." At this point, he runs towards her. He's this close. He's a big man. He's not small. He's bigger than me, and he's got muscles, and he's in her face, and he's yelling. And there's terrible words coming out of his mouth, and he's telling her what a piece of rubbish she is, what a piece of absolute, sorry for this, shit she is, because she doesn't understand what she has to do. And he is livid. So I'm trying to get in between them to stop him shouting at her. And she runs upstairs. She absolutely flies up the stairs. He's after her in a split second. He is behind her, and he is furious. And she doesn't get into her bedroom quick enough to shut the door. So she's in her bedroom. He's in her bedroom. I fly up the stairs after her. I'm there. I'm in the room too. He's got her up against the wardrobe like this, and he's yelling. He's really in her face, and he is yelling at her. And he's pushing her towards the window, and the window's open, and he's threatening with throwing her out, threatening her to be thrown out of the window. And I can see how scared she is. And I'm jumping on his back, and I'm pulling at his clothes, and I'm shouting at him, "Please don't do this. Don't do it. Stop. Leave her alone. Stop." And for a minute, he turns round to look at me, to shout at me. And in that second, I shout, "Run!" And she does. She runs downstairs, and she runs out of the house. And she's gone. And that night, she stays at her boyfriend's, as she does lots of nights. The yelling carried on most of that evening. It was the next day that I suddenly realised that it's just too much. And it was the next day that me and my daughter and my son ended up in a refuge. Now, I have 3 children. I have an older daughter. Before this incident, things had got so bad for her at home that I took the decision. I didn't leave this relationship. I didn't leave this man. I took the decision to send her to live with my sister because things had got too dangerous for her. So she was living at my sister's. She was suffering from anxiety. She was suffering from panic attacks. She was self-harming. My daughter, who's in the room here, she was really struggling with anxiety, panic attacks. She'd attempted suicide a couple of times to try and get my attention. I'd let all that had carried on around me, and I hadn't done anything about it. I hadn't protected her. To say she hated me was an understatement. To say that she thought I was pathetic and useless, a waste of space, a rubbish mom, was a total understatement. She didn't get on with her sister at all. They hated each other. In our house, it was very much a rule of divide and conquer. He would get in between all of us, divide us, so we had no connection and we couldn't help each other. My son, who was at that time, he was 9. He was suffering from terrible anger issues. They were watching him at school, and he had violent outbursts of temper at home. And even at 9 years old, it's quite frightening when they throw themselves at you, kicking and punching, and they're very angry with you. So we were a family in a complete and utter mess. We went for counselling, and during the counselling, we were told that the best that we could ever hope for was that we would find strategies to cope. Somebody asked a question about post-traumatic stress disorder. We were told that the best that we could do was cope with the waking up in the night with flashbacks of what had happened to us and what had gone on. The guilt that I felt over what had happened to my children, I just cannot tell you how terrible, how guilty I felt about it. But in 2011, I came across a man named Jamie Smart, and I had a little recording that he put out at that time that was free. I was cleaning a holiday cottage to try and make ends meet. And I was listening, I just had my ears in, and I was mopping the kitchen floor, and I was just listening to this recording. And we'd been limping along, we were trying to do our best as a family, I was trying to rebuild things with us. And I'm there mopping the floor, and I'm listening. Jamie Smart has just come across the principles, and he'd just come across Sydney Banks, and he's talking about Sydney Banks, and he's talking about the principles. And all of a sudden, I stood still, and I dropped the mop, and I sat on the floor, and I sobbed. Because what I heard him say was that I wasn't damaged, my children weren't damaged, that fundamentally there was nothing wrong with any of us. There wasn't any bad after effects of what had happened to us, nothing. And in that instance, for me, I heard that so deeply. I knew that about me then, and I knew that about my children. And I went home, and for a little while, I think people thought I'd gone a little bit mad. But over time, as I began to understand that more deeply, everything in my life changed. And fast forward to April of this year, April the 15th of this year, my daughter got married. There was a moment, there were many, many moments in the preparation of that wedding, and many moments on that day that I could share with you that showed where we had come, how far we had come as a family. We were stood there just looking at each other. How amazing are we? We are so close. There is so much love in our household. Everything that we do comes from a foundation of security and love and trust, and that was about us far away from what our household used to be. These principles are absolutely magic. They are just unbelievable. To come from where we were, my daughter is in this room, you can ask her what she thought about me, how she felt about me, and what her life was like. I'm sure she won't mind. To come from where we were to where we are now feels to me like it is unbelievable that that could happen. I never, ever thought that my family would be okay. I never thought we would be the people that we are today. And the thing that I was, it's like, love is always the answer. What was the question?